Hi, I'm Spencer Ziegler.
Hi, and I'm Mellisa Smith, and welcome to Data Lit, a podcast for educators by educators. In this season of Data Lit, we've had some previous episodes around assessments, but you can't really discuss assessments without kind of getting into grading. In fact, the recent book study on cultural responsive assessments that we talked about included a chapter on grading. And so today, Spencer and I are going to unpack some of the principles that the authors of that chapter, Susan Brookhart and Dwayne Chisholm, shared from their research. So Spencer, in your journey as an educator, what was a challenge you faced when you were grading student work?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think if you were to ask me that then, I think my answer would have been, are these numbers defensible? If a student or a parent pushes back and says, why is this a 89 versus a 90 or something, am I going to be able to speak and defend the precise difference between those two numbers? Mm-hmm. In hindsight, I think what I perhaps could have been more concerned about is more so the validity of the grades. Were they measuring students' understanding the standards, or was other stuff seeping in? Be it, behaviors or the task itself, or just their comfort with the testing environment, all those other things, were those working its way into the number that I was reporting?
I think for me, it would have been something similar. Being a math teacher, I would think, it's easy to grade because, as long as I ask my kids to show their work, I'm just like, the grade is the grade, right? And so the numbers kind of speak for themselves. Mm-hmm. But then, like you said, over the years, there are things where you're looking at a grade, and even though you see lines of student work, like I know that when I first started teaching, I was very particular about how students line up work. That used to rub me the wrong way. And, I'd be like, all right, well, the only way to get their attention is to take off points, right?
Yeah.
So, doing things like that. And so, but like you said, at the end, if I have to defend the grade or explain the grade to the student, because I always see grades as a language, right? It's how my students and I communicate with each other about where they are. How can I defend that with just one number? Because that one number is speaking about everything.
Right. Yeah, I like that language, where I think too often I used it as a tool trying to motivate students instead. And you can do one or the other. You can't really do both. Right.
I would agree with that. And so one of the things that in this book that they talk about is this notion of equitable grading. Mm-hmm. And so grading is equitable, they say, when it focuses on reporting where students are against where they are intended to be, right? As a teacher, that's what I'm trying to do. You took a test. This is where you are based on the things that I'm asking you to demonstrate. And so Brookhart and Chisholm, they provided this unique way of defining equitable grading, which is interesting because they also say it includes the equitable assessments, the learning environment. Mm-hmm. Would you share with us what was that sort of definition that they used?
Yeah, so they refer to research on inequitable practice, saying that there's kind of three elements. 1, everyone is grounded in common purpose. 2, everyone gets what they need. And 3, everyone has open access to resources. So you can apply this to any number of practices, but for grading, so everyone's grounded in common purpose. So to me, that speaks to, like, is the criteria clear and standards-based and all those kind of things. And it's clear to the graders, but it's also clear to those that are showing what they know on the assessment.
Right.
Then the other 2, everyone gets what they need and everyone has open access to resources, makes me think of kind of instruction, use of formative assessment, that feedback going through, and perhaps some of that universal designs for learning where people can show what they know in any number of ways, because it's about their ability to communicate what they know, not their ability to jump through the hoops that we might put in front of them.
Yeah, when I read that definition, I made a note about visible learning. We say visible learning, that's part of Hattie's work. Mm-hmm. But again, that is sort of the true essence, right? We're trying to make teaching visible and as transparent as possible. And then we're asking our students to do the same when they're showing us, well, did you get what I said, right? And they're trying to also make that clear and visible as possible. So
Yeah.
I like that. So if you've studied any of the grading gurus, right? So I remember when O'Connor or Gusky or even Bernhardt, they all gave us these tips as educators for how to make grading fair or equitable. And I think all of those practices or strategies can be summarized in like three main pillars about grades. One, that grades should be an accurate representation of a student's performance. So I think as a teacher, we're always trying to make sure that that is right. Because like you said, if it's a language and the student is saying, this is what I know.
Right.
You're also trying to make sure that, okay, this is definitely showing what you know and are able to do. The second thing, I like how they say this, grades should be bias resistant.
Yeah.
I like that phrase in terms of bias resistant, meaning that your grades, like you said, you want to make sure it's defensible. So you want to make sure that the evidence of that grade or the score or the evidence that the student is showing you is not tainted by anything else. And that's really hard because we're human beings, right? But what you're trying to score or grade is student performance. And so you want to make sure that it's free of all bias.
Yep.
And then the third one is grades should motivate students to succeed by supporting this idea of growth mindset. And I had to pause on that one because, normally we say grades shouldn't, you just don't use grades alone for motivation purposes. But thinking about it as I remember myself as a student where when I had struggled with math, because I always got low grades, I sort of felt as though that was like me, like I couldn't get any better.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to try. And so one of the things that they're trying to do is a grade being something like you said, if it's a language within the grade of itself, and if there is that transparency, I know what I'm able to do. Like I can see clearly like, oh, this is where I am. To get to this level, this is kind of what I know I need to do, right? So that to instead of limiting you and being like, I can't do this, it's just me, sort of giving me the capability of with the right tools, with the right support, and if I ask questions, I can also get better.
Yeah, I like how you put it in the if-then kind of thing, whereas I think grades can be motivational if you have those other things.
Right.
If they are an accurate representation and if bias isn't creeping in.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, because it's a useful depiction of where you are in terms of the thing you've been working hard on, then it can be helpful. There's some like research on like feedback in video games or even like any kind of game theory about those kind of labels as a way to kind of push people a little bit further. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. It will be negligent of us to kind of talk about grades without talking about one of the challenges that we all kind of talk about in terms of keeping the grading pure, right? So that there is this challenge, they said, in terms of individual or variation that comes from teachers. Because again, it's human beings judging other human beings' work. So can you speak to us about some of those inequities in grading that they discussed in that chapter?
Yeah, they mentioned kind of two potential pitfalls in terms of inter-rater reliability.
Yeah.
Two people grading the same work, and perhaps giving
different.
Yeah. So they mention in this, they see, the quote was, amazingly large variations in teacher evaluation of the same work. And one of the things that kind of really helps there is making sure that there's criteria. And we'll talk about this a little bit later as well. The more specific the criteria is, the more this is going to help here. They also, and related to this, they refer to studies that showed that different teachers incorporate different elements into their grades, including both achievement and non-achievement factors. So that these two kind of speak to each other.
Yes.
The more teachers are allowing these other things to kind of slip in, be it intentionally because you need to line up your work this way, or because these are the steps in the task, or because, spelling matters or some of those kind of things, the more you're going to have variation.
Yeah. And so, I like how you talk about just those are two things that we have to be mindful of. They're there. And as a teacher, when you're grading, it is good to kind of just always kind of be questioning yourself. am I checking myself, right, for any of these inconsistencies? So let's move on to the crux of the chapter when they talk about these principles that are available or we should adhere to when it comes to equitable grading. The first one I like is report student performance on key grade levels or course standards. So in essence, trying to boil everything down to one grade, because we all know that, you give a C or a D or something like that, and the kid like, how did I get an F? What does that mean? Or what does the A mean? Or nobody ever asks what an A mean. Everybody asks what a C, D, or E means, but nobody ever asks, what does an A or a B mean? It's only when, the grades are not favorable that we want to know what does it all mean. And so, with that principle is like, is it possible that instead of having one vague letter grade, maybe we can report on specific intended learning outcomes? This sort of sounds very familiar to standards-based grading, or its more unfamiliar cousin, competency grading. And where we look at specific standards, power standards, if you want to say, and then talk about what would it look like just for those standards? What does performance look like just on those things? I think one of the things in our district, we do a really good job in terms of we do have standards-based grading at the elementary level, but then you have what happens at the secondary level. And it's not to say that you couldn't do this. One of the things I like in the article is if you were to do more traditional grading, they provided these questions that I think is worth asking yourself to see if you can incorporate some of those into your grading, even though you're doing more traditional grading and can't do true standards-based grading. So for example, they said, what learning goal does the standard describe in both the content or the cognitive level? Another one is like, what questions or tasks will give you clear evidence of students' learning in regard to that role? So again, always asking yourself, what evidence would suffice to show you mastery? Another one I liked is thinking about your scoring schema or the report that will come out. What would you count as evidence, and how will you know that it's accurate, right? So whatever you see, what will determine accuracy or validity from your point of view? And then the third one is, what are some extraneous factors, for example, artistic ability, reading ability, or other unrelated knowledge or skills that should be avoided when you design your questions or tasks? And oftentimes I think, like I know when, like if I had a class and in that class, I know I had students who were, English wasn't their first language. I always had to think about, if I want to know what they know in terms of math, would it be okay if I translated the question for them in this instance? Because I really want to kind of unpack what is their understanding of, whatever content. And so trying to just ask myself, is it just asking them an English only question? Is that a barrier within itself? So again, one of those principles, that principle again about, can we report student performance only? What are some things that we can do to only get on student performance?
Yeah, I like that piece, and kind of focusing on those key standards. I think one of the questions is just, what is the purpose of grading? And if grading is only about labeling and sorting kids and putting in categories, you don't care as much about this. But if grading is meant to communicate where you are and where you hope they can be, then that's where this can really be helpful, because it becomes much more actionable if you can point to the specific thing that you did. If I'm getting graded for baking and I just have one giant C, I don't know where to improve. Right. But if I'm getting either through standard-based grading or through accompanying feedback, saying like, okay, what happened was the measuring or the stirring or whatever it might be, then that all of a sudden becomes a clear language, to borrow your metaphor.
And it becomes a tricky practice to kind of put into place because, again, remember, we always talk about that three-legged stool, right? So curriculum, your instruction, and assessments are part of it. And so we're not saying by any means don't teach everything that you're supposed to teach, right? But when you are looking to grade, what would you emphasize in all of the things that you're teaching? So I want to make sure that we're being clear, not to say that everything can't be taught, but when you're looking to give feedback, what are the things that you definitely want to give the most in-depth feedback about, so that, again, students can show you what they know and learn. All right, what's the second one?
So this one, Burkhardt has referenced this in a few pieces, and it always kind of strikes me as fascinating but intuitive when you stop and think of it. And that's use a limited number of performance categories.
Yeah.
And there's kind of two levels that we can think of this. One, the starting point is the 0 to 100 scale. So for that, you have 101 discrete labels, discrete levels of performance. And can we really differentiate with precision? Can we break down student work into 101 separate levels with separate, you land here for this, land here for that. Here's anchor works for this, anchor works for that.
Yeah.
And the simplest way to start is just chop it in half, 50 to 100 scale, if nothing else, just because there's mathematical reasons why a 0 to 100 scale is problematic to start with.
Well, because the F, right? That is that is what, 0 to 69?
Yeah. So an example, say there's a student and there's 5 assessments and they have a 75, an 85, a 70, a 90, and then a 0. That 0 might be that they didn't get it. That might be that they just didn't turn it in, which is two different things.
Yep.
So the median there is a 75. But if you take the average, you get a 64, which is, that DF kind of range there. Yeah. If nothing else, moving that 0 to a 50, because, that all of a sudden puts the average up to 74, which feels much more representative
of all the other. Yep.
Yeah. So that's one thing. With that said, one of the things that Burkhardt stresses is that she cites research that teachers can only distinguish levels of quality among roughly 5 points on the scale when we're talking about that. So she really recommends simply using a shorter scale, like a 1 to 4, like an A through F, 1 to 4, any of those kind of pieces there. And that all of a sudden becomes much simpler to wrap your head around what truly is the difference between an A and a B, a 4 and a 3, whatever it might be. And you can also go back to that equitable practices definition, and everyone is grounded in a common purpose, and it's clear to everyone. You can provide exemplars and things like that.
Yes.
So students going through, not only can the teacher figure out where they can fall, it's going to be much easier for a student to look at these resources and say, is this more of a 2 or a 3? Whereas we can't ask students to differentiate between a 70 or 71 or 72 or 73 or 74. So that as much as possible, and we're all dealing with different limitations based on what we're teaching, but as much as possible, shrink down those performance categories to as few as we can.
To me, when I went to college, they had more gradations. So you had like an A plus, A minus, B, it was all of that. And I think now, as I'm going through my MSA, it's just, you just have an A or a B, right? So I think we've done better in terms of limiting some of that. Same thing too in our district for standards-based grading. We used to have a 3-star, 4. Yeah. We got rid of the 3-star. So I think in essence, we try to limit some of those performance categories, because again, wrapping your head around what is the distinction between gets really hard for teachers.
Yeah. All right, what was the next piece?
So the third one was report academic and non-academic performance separately. Again, that kind of goes back to what we first started about, is when you are grading, sometimes allowing things like effort to sort of seep in. And so they're suggesting that we keep those two things separate. If the purpose of grading is to tell students this is where you are in terms of the intended measures, then that should be very separate in terms of your participation or your effort, like, all of the things that should be done separately. And not that you don't pay attention to it. You just record it separately and keep it out of the grade. I think in our district, we do, for our standards-based grading, we do have a separate scale for non-academic behaviors as well, right? So we have a different scale. And so teachers can talk about, what counts as a 1, 2, 3 in terms of these non-academic behaviors, and keep that separate. I think that's a worthy ask for that one.
Yeah, and with this, I was reading Educational Leadership has a piece called Is That Grade Accurate by Joe Feldman? And I think he summed up nicely the reason for this. And he wrote in that when we blend non-instructional factors into the grade, we diminish its power to communicate meaningful information about what a student has learned. The B that collapses academic and non-academic information cannot communicate whether the student had strong content knowledge but did not return assigned form, or had weaker understanding but completed all non-academic tasks. So I think, and one thing to stress here is it's not don't report the non-academic side, don't report behaviors or those kind of things. It's doing it separately. And that also benefits those areas just as much, because when everything's grouped in, you don't know what the B is referring to. It also pushes us to think strategically about how we're reporting out some of those behaviors and those work habits, those kind of things, so that we're using the same kind of principles to those reporting as well. So I think this is a win-win.
Yeah, most definitely. All right, what about the next one?
So next is provide multiple opportunities for demonstrating success. Yeah, this is fascinating, and this one has a lot of context I think is needed for it. But I mean, essentially, students learn at different rates because they're humans.
Right.
And we are not measuring how quickly they learn the standards. We're measuring the degree to which they learn the standards.
Good distinction.
Yeah, and therefore you need as much as possible, without burning yourself out, to provide some of that flexibility. There's another educational leadership piece called 5 Inconvenient Truths About How We Grade, that like someone there as an educator was saying that they use like an A, B, and not yet kind of a model there, which I thought was kind of fascinating approach. Now, in this chapter, Brooke Hart kind of talks about like the ideal and then in reality. And she talks about, if it's like one-on-one tutoring, then yes, you can really apply this kind of principle to make sure that students are showing it when they're able to one of those, because you have a 1-to-1 ratio. But she pointed out that in reality, it's hard to do that with 30 kids in your room, every single one there. So she writes, redos and retakes are simply a mechanism to deal with this situation. Typically, students must indicate what they have done to further their learning before they're allowed to redo a task or retake a test. So this one, I think, is a matter of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good and burning yourself out in quarter one and then having nothing left in quarter two. So knowing in an ideal world, each kid is kind of taking these assessments whenever they're ready and stuff like that, but you got to figure out how to do this practically without kind of messing up your scope and sequence too much.
I think when I read this, sometimes as a teacher, I hear about multiple opportunities for demonstrating success. And sometimes as a teacher, I think, oh, that means allow them to do it as a book report or as a recording or as, that kind of way. And sometimes we have to be careful that the method that we're asking is not a barrier to the student demonstrating.
Yep.
Right. Yep. The ability of what they know and can do. And so when we're thinking about giving them multiple opportunities for demonstrating, you kind of have to know your student as well, right?
Yeah.
So you don't want to be giving them an opportunity to demonstrate, but the opportunity of itself is what's getting in the way.
Yeah. And that probably, how are you gauging what they know as we go through, I think leads us to the next one.
Yeah. And so that one was about provide multiple opportunities for formative assessment before grading. And I love that one because it speaks to both the value of formative assessment, which is usually ungraded, and summative assessments, which those are typically graded. Because the thing about it is, very rarely does a student, receives instruction and masters it right away, right? That is rare. And so you need those opportunities to practice, get feedback, right? Because that's part of the feedback group, to be like, is this what you meant?
Yeah.
Okay. No, not quite. Okay. Get feedback, keep going back and forth in a really safe environment, because whether we like it or not, when you get that grade, again, it does something to you. So you want to have that ungraded moment, but you still have to be able to provide feedback.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people think that the ungraded means there's nothing happening. To me, that is when you should be getting feedback, but it could be descriptive feedback, and it doesn't have to be a graded feedback.
Yeah. Think about what kind of feedback you would want from your boss. You want the feedback before that summative evaluation kind of comes along. And that's much more easy to receive than act on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And with this one too, I think it's important to stress that this formative feedback can come in a variety of forms, like teacher feedback, but also self-feedback and peer feedback.
Oh, yeah.
And I like Douglas Fisher and Nancy Fry have written about this a bit. And there's a great piece from Grading to Guiding. And there's 2 quotes there that stood out to me for this one. They say, when students learn to self-assess, the role of the teacher changes from being the sole arbiter of learning to becoming a validator who confirms understanding and a challenger who pushes students thinking further, which I like that position to put teachers in. And then later they write, imagine if assessments weren't just about grades, but about students using them to adjust their learning in real time. It's a life skill. So start small.
Your first quote about the self-assessment reminded me about Dylan Williams' work around the formative assessment process.
Yeah.
And he has these 5 practices, one of them being ensuring that students self-assess. Because again, that's that transference of knowledge, right? Where it's less about the teacher and more about the student. Because if you don't get the student involved in the assessment process, and typically doing that during the formative assessment part of it, you don't get that transference of knowledge, right? So he always talked about the importance of self-assessment. That is such a key part that we tend to leave out.
Yep.
And it's more than just, let me show you my work, let me show you your work, right? We have to be able to have some sort of rubric or a metric to be like, okay, I see your work and I can give you feedback. It's not just, okay, I show you mine and you show me yours, but we're still able to sort of perform that role of a quote unquote teacher, to be able to give you feedback against, a rubric or some sort of checklist.
Yeah, well put.
As we wrap up, what is one piece of advice for our listeners based on what you've learned from this chapter?
I'd say for this one, touching on what you just referenced, the resources that help nudge you into this. And they reference rubrics a little bit and mentioning that the authors refer to a broad meta-analysis that found evidence of teacher bias in overall expectations for students, referral rates, and positive and negative speech. But they found that when a rubric was used, and thus when explicit criteria were used in grading, there was no bias.
Ooh.
So the more specific you can be with those criteria, back to that original definition about equitable practices, the more it can be clear to everyone just what is being assessed and how it is being assessed and what are the criteria and just the academic, the non-academic, all those kind of things there, that can be investing a little bit of time in developing that and then also sharing it with students on the front end so they understand how it works. I think that can help quite a bit in terms of establishing equitable grading.
Yeah. For me, there was a line in the book that said, no grading system improves student learning by itself. I don't want it to be said that, grading is an easy thing. It is better for us to sort of give clear and more meaningful guidelines. Yeah. And we can do so by having these sort of conversations. Like, I'm hoping that this episode can be that kind of support that teachers need to just keep examining their practices. Everybody can get better when it comes to grading. And again, if the purpose of grades is to help students know where they are and what they're able to do, just having that discussion to be willing to go deeper is a first start. So thank you, Spencer, for the opportunity for us to, share a little bit more about grading. I'm sure this will not be the last time we talk about it, because it's always good to kind of come back to it over and over. And so thank you for sitting with me and helping me have this conversation with our listeners.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to also thank Lukas Brandon from Green Hope High School for our theme music. The website is linked in our show notes, and any of the references that we have will also be in those descriptions. If you have any questions or comments, you can always contact us at datalit@wcpss.net. And until next time, goodbye.
Take care.